Vicki?
Yes.
Oh, I just heard that you are recording, right?
Yes.
Great.
I just turned it on. Okay, next month is QPR training. We are going to be welcoming Melissa Dow from the Minnesota Department of Health. She is providing us with QPR training, which is suicide prevention training. This is open to anyone and everyone. We want everybody to be able to experience this training. It is so critical. I know a lot of people think that they will never need this training, but we are all advocates for mental health, mental wellness, and the odds are actually pretty good that we will need this training. We will need to talk somebody through this. We're going to need the tools and the language on how to help someone think about this. So it's absolutely free. It's for your whole congregation. It's for your leaders, your volunteers, your church, your friends, your family, everyone. But I do need you to register because for one, if you are coming in person, I need to know that so that we have a big enough space. And I need to let Melissa know how many people will be there as well. You can register on our website, mhconnect.org/events. And you'll see right at the top there, it's QPR training, and there's a link to go ahead and register. And again, I will put all this stuff in the notes as well that you'll receive tomorrow. Now let's get to our meeting tonight. This month, this whole month of July is National BIPOC Mental Health Month. And so tonight we're going to be talking all about that. Cynthia Fashaw, am I saying that right, Cynthia?
Mm-hmm.
Is the Director of Children's Programs and Multicultural Outreach at Nami, Minnesota. So she is in charge of children's, youth, and young adult programs and directs outreach and training to multicultural communities. Cynthia provides training to parents, foster parents, youth, and professionals, and develops and conducts trainings in cultural communities. She provides information, education, and training on mental health, suicide prevention, postvention, school success for K through 12 and post-secondary students, crisis planning, and a number of other trainings. She is a certified instructor for mental health first aid, which is also an amazing class, and youth mental health first aid, also an amazing class, and suicide prevention. We are so lucky to have you tonight. Thank you for joining us, Cynthia. Go ahead and take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Vicki, for having me. Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know about NAMI, I'll just take a second and explain who we are and what we do. NAMI stands for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And we're really a grassroots organization dedicated to improving the lives of both people who live with mental illnesses and their families. We do education, advocacy, and support. Almost all of our classes are free to parents and foster parents and guardians, because we don't believe that people should have to pay to get the help they need to help themselves or someone they care about. Everyone who works at NAMI either lives with a mental illness or has a family member who lives with a mental illness. And so in addition to getting both the clinical perspective, you also get the lived perspective. So tonight's training really is designed to not just have me be the talking head, but to also have you chime in, ask questions. I know that's, I'm not from Minnesota, and I know that that's not a Minnesota norm, is to ask questions during the training and to talk, but seriously, it's really okay. This is, I hope to engage you, and I hope to be able to answer questions or at least participate in discussion around the mental health of people in the BIPOC community. So this training was initially developed for the African-American community. Much of the data also pertains to other folks in BIPOC communities. So if you have questions or comments, raise your hand. And if I happen to miss something in the chat, I would greatly appreciate Vicki or Heidi, if you wouldn't mind just stopping me and letting me know what's, the questions. So without further ado, let's hope that this works. Okay, come on. Oh, there we go. All right, what we're going to talk about tonight is, I know most of you have mental health background, but I wanted to make sure that I would be inclusive of absolutely everybody, in case someone is, in the audience that may not have all of the same background. So we're going to just briefly touch on trauma. And then we're going to turn to layers of racialized trauma. That's a topic we could probably spend, a week talking about, but we're just going to hit on just some points to lay the foundation for our ultimate discussion on the impact in BIPOC communities on help seeking. So we're going to look at a little bit of, about the relationship between race and discrimination and how it impacts trauma, collateral consequences, and then talk about the need for mental health, help seeking with BIPOC community, and then have some resources. And again, please raise your hand at any time or put something in the chat, and we'll get your questions answered. So we start out our discussion about what mental health is, so we're all on the same page. Mental health really encompasses all the things that make us human: how we think, feel, and act, how we respond to everyday challenges, how we cope with stressors. In essence, it deals also with our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. Mental health is really important at every stage of life, from childhood to old, to the later years. I don't use the word old now that I'm over 30. But we all know what we're talking about, those other years. Many things can affect mental health. It can be stress, trauma, mental health conditions, a number of things. So both 1 in 5 children and 1 in 5 adults will experience a mental illness at some point in their lifetime. So in any given classroom of 30 kids, you can pretty much expect about 6 kids to be experiencing a mental health condition. More than half of all adults, American adults, will at some point in their life have symptoms that qualify as a mental health condition. So why am I telling you this? Well, number one, mental illnesses are common. They're a lot more common than the discussion about them would lead you to believe. We don't talk about mental health conditions. So fewer than half of people who live with a mental illness obtain treatment, and that number is significantly less for people from the BIPOC communities, I'm going to say cultural communities. I don't know how many people know what the acronym stands for, so I'll just refer to it as cultural communities. That encompasses a wide swath of people. The average amount of time that somebody lives with a mental illness is about 11 years before they get help. And that means some people, from the time they get symptoms that start, receive help. And the midpoint is 11 years. So half of people get help from the time their illness starts to 11 years, the other half from 11 years to end of life. About half of all people who live with lifetime cases of mental illness, the mental illness starts by the age of 14. Another 1/4 starts as young people are making their entrance into adult life at age 24, with about age 24. And the last quarter, from 24 to, again, end of life. Let's see. So there are a number of, nobody really knows how a person gets a mental illness. But it's generally thought that there are biological factors. We know mental illnesses run in families. Genetics, they run in families. There are biological factors. We know that, substances, chemical imbalances, there are a lot of different biological factors that can affect mental health. We know that trauma is implicated in mental health. Extreme stress, and things like infections in the brain. So tonight we're going to really focus on trauma. And trauma often occurs after someone has experienced a traumatic event that caused, intense fear, helplessness, or horror, where their basic life assumptions like, I'm safe, adults are safe, the world is a safe place, people are good, where those assumptions are challenged. Both children and adults can be affected by trauma. We know that even very, very, very young infants can experience trauma. And children in that age that experience trauma exhibit the symptoms of trauma non-verbally. Because if they experienced the trauma before they had language, their body is what is how the trauma is expressed. So we know that both children and adults can experience trauma. A traumatic event can be a single event, or it can be a series of experiences or events. Trauma can result from situations like long-term poverty, oppression, discrimination. But again, it's where a person has a sense of fear or horror, and they may experience feelings of powerlessness, fear, or hopelessness. All right, so chronic stress. Well, we know that fear and uncertainty can trigger stress for not only children, but for adults as well. And stress, as most of us probably know, can be toxic. So this can contribute to the higher incidence of stress-related illnesses such as heart disease, diabetes, stroke, obesity, etc. So anytime someone is exposed to uncertainty, it can trigger a stress response where our bodies go on alert, our heart beats faster, blood pressure rises, glucose floods the bloodstream to get you ready for fight, flight, or freeze. Basically, this is our body's adaptation to ensuring that we survive, that we run away from predators, or that we're able to either fight back or escape until the threat passes. But when threats are constant, our systems don't know when to return to normal, which is really important if someone is experiencing consistent arousal or stress. So I'm trying to interweave both for adults and for children. So I'll kind of go back and forth here because some of the symptoms and effects are just slightly different for children than they are adults. So children experience stress, distress, and trauma. So children who experience early trauma, again, may experience cognitive challenges where they may be thinking about the trauma and they may experience difficulty in school because of the inability to focus, and they may feel foggy. But another way in which a child might exhibit the effects of early trauma is they may exhibit anger management difficulties. Out of nowhere, they may have difficulty regulating their anger. So school difficulties, focus, and anger management. So traumatic events can be one event or many events over time. So Minnesota is a very diverse state, particularly the Twin Cities. And we have people from war-torn countries here. We have people from all kinds of traumatic backgrounds that might include torture, murder, all types of backgrounds. And so it's not hard to see why this statement is true, that traumatic events that can range from one event to many events over time can affect mental health. And so some of the things that constitute a trauma are war, terrorism, violence, police activity, incarceration of an individual or parental incarceration, poverty, bullying. There are a lot of trauma experiences. Trauma is in the eye of the beholder. So if you have two children, a set of twins, one experiencing the same thing, one may re-experience the event and it may have a trauma effect on them, and the other may move through it over time. Again, trauma is in the eye of the beholder. But what we do know is that the more types of trauma that a person experiences, the more likely will that trauma affect their mental health. So when it affects the mental health of children, it can result in a child experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And again, it comes after a child has experienced intense fear, helplessness, or horror. And that can be either experiencing it, they can experience trauma from hearing about it, or even learning about a violent or traumatic event. They don't have to be directly the person that experienced it. So in terms of trauma, the results of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder can last for years, way after the event is over. And again, some of the symptoms of trauma are intrusive thoughts, re-experiencing the events. And that can happen so much so that it may be difficult to focus. It can cause challenges in school, challenges on the job. Some people experience nightmares. And I know that children who've experienced trauma may also experience hallucinations and flashbacks, but you also might see avoidance, that they avoid the things that remind them of the traumatic event. And this can result in avoiding everything from thoughts, feelings, conversations associated with the incident, to avoiding activities, places, or people that cause them to remember it. But a really important side effect of a symptom of trauma is increased arousal. And so people in increased arousal stay in that fight or flight phase, where they may be agitated, easily to anger. And so we're going to focus, I have these in red because we're going to particularly focus on those tonight. Symptoms in adults who've experienced trauma range from, flashbacks to having racing thoughts, feelings of guilt or shame, lots of anxiety, negative self-image, out-of-body experiences known as dissociation, but also feelings of depression and feelings of anger or rage, in addition to things like trouble sleeping, changes in eating habits, those kind of somatic things associated with, you would think, with like depression or anxiety. So we're going to talk a little bit about the intersection of race, discrimination, and trauma. Most of us probably have been in Minnesota the last year and a half. And this has been a year and a half like no other. It's been a year of challenge with the onset of COVID. And I don't know about you, but I just remember during this period of time every day of hearing the death rate, how many hundreds of thousands of people died. And then later on hearing the disproportionate deaths of African-American people due to COVID for a number of reasons. As if that wasn't enough, which it really was, came the death of George Floyd and the aftermath of that very visual interaction with the police that resulted in George Floyd's death. So on top of COVID, now, we have a situation where, we're seeing this video day in and day out on the news. And when you think about trauma and to see in video a man die, crying for his mother, I can't think of a better example of trauma. So our discussion begins with just looking at some of the experiences of Black and Brown people in America. Again, this is an unprecedented time, and what we're experiencing now is way beyond normal everyday challenges. Fear, loss, confusion, strife, And many of these things are really our new situations that we're experiencing for the first time and may not have coping skills to deal with them. Additionally, most of us have had our children home. A good number of people have had children home that they've been homeschooling. And that in and of itself is very stress producing. And then came the unrest after George Floyd's death. And so this part of the training really looks at the impact on Black and Brown people of what happened during that period of time. So Black and Brown people's experience in America is fraught with historical trauma, trauma from systemic racism, racialized trauma, and interpersonal trauma. And we're going to just talk briefly about each one. So historical trauma, it's also known as multi-generational trauma, is trauma that continues to have an impact over time. Historical trauma stems from massive group trauma experience. And so think things like the Holocaust, let's see, American Indian children being taken from their homes and boarding schools, the passage of African Americans in enslavement. And the thing about historical trauma is it's passed from generation to generation. And the process by which this happens is really called epigenetics. We're not even going to go into that. But it's, when, you talk about historical trauma, that you can experience 3 generations later, the trauma that your great-grandparent, your grandparent experienced, can seem like, how does that work? And basically it's in how our cells, how our DNA and our genes react, same genes, but different way that they show their effect. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but I think about my family. We're a family that are both African American and American Indian. And I never really thought much about it till I went to a training on pretty much American Indians and trauma. And the presenter began to present a picture of what it looked like for this current generation. And I realized what they were talking about were things that described my mother. And I was taken aback because I'd always seen some of her habits and her ways and her anxiety. And I just thought that was who she was. And I didn't realize that what I was really seeing is her generational trauma coming forth. And I don't know what it looks like for me. My kids could probably tell you, write a book maybe but that trauma is, I call it the first layer of trauma. And that, is passed down, through generations. So you start with that first layer. The next layer of trauma actually is racialized trauma. And it's the effect of racial trauma starts prior to birth with the changes to the next generation's genes, and that's historical trauma, that reflect the culmination of previous generations' trauma. Consider the different types of trauma that can impact a fetus. Their parents' experience, not only historic trauma, but toxic stress. If you have a parent that is chronically underemployed or under stress, and their body is producing cortisol, the hormone, the fetus is being bathed in cortisol. Then there's the day-to-day trauma of racism and discrimination, and the resulting loss or reduced access to opportunity that's been well documented in this country. So an unborn child is exposed to the effects of trauma even before birth. Fight or flight, stress, then the next layer of trauma begins after birth. Has anybody here heard of the term microaggressions? Can I see, let's see, a hand? Would somebody volunteer to tell me what a microaggression is?
We're being very Minnesotan.
I know.
I'll be brave because I just went through my DE&I training at work. So my understanding is that it's those small kind of aside comments or slights that maybe people don't even realize that they're doing that then impact negatively on usually a person of color or someone of a minority group. Is that fair?
Absolutely fair. Absolutely. So you did well with your training. Thank you,
They
Allison.
said I wouldn't get graded, but I'm going to take that back to them.
Well, I'm telling you, you got an A tonight.
Thank you.
So yes, absolutely. And microaggressions refers to what people consider to be slights. Things like, oh, what's my personal favorite? Oh, do you work? In a situation where no one else would ever be asked if they work. They would just be asked what they do for work. So then there's an assumption or, looking really carefully at a check front and back and checking 2 different forms of ID, those kinds of things that happen. And so the reason that I have this word listed as macroaggressions, it's not a typo, but so even though microaggressions are considered everyday slights that people of color experiences, the term macroaggression focuses on the microaggression focuses on the intent of the person rather than the effect it has on the people experiencing it. So the effect of microaggressions is a 10-year shorter lifespan for people of color. A doctor here at Children's Hospital did a research comparing the life expectancy of African Americans who are born in this country and Africans that are born in Africa and come here. The life expectancy for African Americans is 10 years, a full 10 years less than Africans that were born in Africa and come here. The life expectancy of Africans is similar to the life expectancy of white Americans that are born and raised here. But the minute that an African person has a baby on this soil, the life expectancy is reduced by 10 years. So microaggressions are one of those things that contribute to stress and duress that lead to stress-related illnesses, heart disease, diabetes, stroke, and they affect a whole group of folks. And anything that has that kind of impact to reduce life expectancy by 10 years is not micro, it is macro. It is a public health crisis. And so I use the word macroaggressions not to talk about the intent of the individual who may have been involved with it, but the impact of the whole group of people that experience them. And so by the time many Black and brown babies are born, macroaggressions have already had an impact on their health. So quickly, a couple of other things that contribute to racialized trauma. Anybody here heard of survival skills? Any parents here talk to your kids about survival skills? No? For those of you that did, I'm asking you, I'm not from Minnesota, please, would you mind unmuting yourself and just kind of talking about what survival skills you talked with your children about and why?
My name is Jill, and in Minnesota, land of 10,000 lakes, we teach our children to swim.
Okay. Oh, that's a good one. Why, and why is that?
Because we love the water, we want to be by the water, and we want to know that we can look away for a second and they can save themselves.
Okay. So it's life-saving to stay alive in the environment. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. Anybody else? Thank you, Jill, by the way. Anyone else?
Yeah, this is Susan. And I think of survival skills as things that you learned as a kid that actually got you through a dysfunctional or painful childhood. like maybe never talking about your feelings or don't make mom mad or something like that. But then it did get you through childhood, but then as an adult, it works against you.
How so?
Well, if you don't think that it's okay to talk about your feelings or ask for your needs to get met as an adult, because that's what you learned as a kid, you have to kind of relearn that.
Okay. So some survival skills are functional at a certain time and not functional at other times.
Right.
Okay. So it kept you safe or safer when you were a child, but it became not functional for safety as an adult.
Right.
Okay. Any other people that talk to you?
Yeah, this is Gary Olson, and
hi, Gary.
I remember as a boy that my mother would always tell me to be respectful of my teachers in school, and not talk back, and not be sassy, but respect them. As a result of that, I still do it, actually, even when I think I'm correct and they're not. But the other side of this is we have our son is biracial. And at least I've had conversations with him about if he gets stopped by the police while he's driving or something, to be respectful, as I learned as a child, and and not be sassy. Don't talk back. Just be respectful and see what they have to say and move on.
Okay. Thank you, Gary.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yep. I will. We raised my grandson, who was African American, and of course the driving thing was important, but also I probably put a lot of pressure on him to get a really good education and make sure that he did everything better than anyone else. Not anyone else, but make sure that he always did his best in those things. And I guess it's maybe not survival, but it's succeeding.
Any thoughts as to why you felt like you needed to give him that message to excel or to do it better?
Because I knew about discrimination, that he'd have to have better qualifications to get a job. And, I was very aware of the discrimination he was experiencing and would continue to experience.
Okay. Thank you very much. Anybody else?
I did that same thing for my girls. I made darn sure that my girls had an excellent education so that they could survive on their own. So I feel like I did that same thing for the girls, knowing what we went through in the 60s and 70s of fighting to make a living. I wanted them to be able to be independent and make a living if they had to. So, yeah.
That's really interesting. That is a perspective of survival skills I hadn't thought about. But my mom did the same thing. After we grew up and all my sisters and I graduated from college, my mother shared with us that she never gave us an option not to go to college.
That's right.
And because it started probably in the womb, I never thought about it. I mean, I just, brush your teeth. Yeah, you're going to college. I mean, there was no other option.
Yes.
I don't, in fact, so much so I don't even think I entertained the idea of not going ever. But yes, so thank you. But there's another level. I'm sorry?
That's survival.
It sure is. And she had the exact same reasons that you did. That she wanted to make sure that no matter what, that we would be able to take care of ourselves, not be dependent on someone, if it was a dangerous situation, or they ended up widowed, et cetera.
Et cetera, yeah.
So there are other kinds of survival skills I'm going to talk about is not just African-American parents, but also parents of children of color. This was originally written for African-American parents. So I apologize that it isn't more inclusive language. But some of the survival skills that, you know, we teach our children, I have two, a son and a daughter, how to enter a store, where to keep your hands, when, you know, where to put your hands when you're ready to pay. Someone mentioned earlier how to talk to police, what to do when stopped by the police. This is so important. You know, study after study has shown that kids that have not been taught survival skills, when they get stopped by the police, they have much, much harsher outcomes. I think of the Central Park 5, where these 5 children were accused of a crime. Half the kids had been, their parents had said, when you're stopped by the police, don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, given your name, say, call my mom, call my mom, call my mom, which is what I taught my children. The other 2, after being questioned, even though it was illegal, the police said, just sign this and we'll let you go home. And they ended up with some phenomenal amount of years in prison for a crime that they did not commit, because they were not taught survival skills. So also, when going into someone's house, what to do and what not to do. If you see a ring or money on the floor, you point to it, but you never, ever, ever pick it up for any reason. We talk a lot in my household about what to wear and what not to wear. I think, like what Gail was saying, you know, my kids didn't have an option not to go to school. I have go to college. My daughter lives with autism and a lot of learning disabilities, but she never had an option not to go to college. And she did graduate from Augsburg College last year, against all the odds, but she didn't have an option. So along with, you know, how to talk, how, you know, comes how to dress, how to present yourself. And there's certain clothes that we talk about that, even though this should be a country you can wear whatever you want, and as women, we know that isn't how things work out. So that there are clothing that you don't wear to draw attention, unwanted attention to yourself. Other discussions are, do not react to degrading treatment or remarks from police. Do not fight back under any circumstance. Temper your tone. I don't care how much you think they're wrong, you think you're right. Temper your tone, and then you can deal with it when you get home. That act with respect, even in the face of disrespectful behavior or treatment. If you get stopped by the police, immediately put your wallet and license and registration on the dashboard in front of the steering wheel, so that the cop can reach in and grab it, so you don't have to make any sudden movements. We talked about not making sudden movements. If you need to sneeze, announce it first. Certainly you can't play with a toy gun. So, you know, a lot of things. And when you think about going through survival skills with children, and we started with our children when they were about 4 or 5, you know, you think about saying, you know, don't, you know, only give your name to the police, don't sign anything, don't agree to anything. It gives them the sense that the world isn't a safe place. And there are adults out there that are not safe people, but you haven't done anything to them. How do they process that, right? And that there are situations where, you know, things bad may happen to you if you don't absolutely follow these rules. And so how do kids process that at that age? And most of the parents that I've talked with about survival skills continue those discussions as they get older, because the list of rules of survival skills grows as they get older. So thinking about that level of trauma and that early level of trauma, you know, earlier we talked about what PTSD is, feeling unsafe, feeling the world is unsafe. When your basic assumptions that all adults or all people are good people, and that when you learn that that may not be the case, that can lead to toxic stress or PTSD. So we know that racial trauma can affect our mental health, self-esteem, physical health, relationship dynamics, and can cause the symptoms we talked about earlier. So the last level of the layers of trauma we're going to talk about really are systemic racism and discrimination. And there's probably no better example of systemic racism and discrimination than the effects of involvement with the criminal justice system. This is one of a long list of dates that unarmed African-American people died at the hands of police. And for many, many, many people in Black and Brown communities, these deaths, these murders, these instances are re-traumatizing. And many communities, many people in communities experience these kinds of events in a communal way. And so even though the trauma may not have happened to you or someone in your family, there's the feeling that it could happen to me or someone in my family. And so when these instances happen, we see an increased trauma response, particularly in communities of color. So when we see this, it reduces the sense of safety, where almost nowhere can feel safe. And that we're constantly reminded that this can happen at any time and could happen to anyone, including your children or yourself. So again, we talked about the collective experience of trauma. The Robina Institute, which is at the U of M, that keeps data on different kinds of interactions with the criminal justice system, has data that Minnesota is the second worst state in the nation when it comes to inequitable and disparate treatment of Black and Brown people in the criminal justice system. And they're second only to Wisconsin. So what's the impact? Well, the impact of police interaction is that, there are 3 times the increased odds of having post-traumatic stress disorder. Now remember, people that have post-traumatic stress disorder can stay in that hyper vigilant state where they may, be in fight or flight or freeze mode, may be easily agitated, may misinterpret actions and may interpret them in terms of a threat to their safety. And so this is a real significant piece of data. 3 times the odds of PTSD in African-American men with high lifetime police stops, and 2 times the increased odds of PTSD in African-American women who've had high police stops. But overall, in general, when those kinds of things happen, you see it on TV, you hear about it in the news, it impacts the community as a whole, where during those times, there are increased people in cultural communities have increased numbers of days out of work, secondary to the reaction to the stress of these situations. So overall, in the African-American community and in the American Indian and Hispanic and Latino community, there is an increased prevalence of PTSD. For African-Americans specifically, it's 9.1%. That means 1 in 10 people in the African-American community is traumatized by and experiencing PTSD symptoms. So what happens to someone when they have post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, they have a higher level of tension and arousal. They may feel on edge or keyed up. They may have emotional or physical feelings of anger. And often when they do, it's more intense. Studies have shown that cultural communities, African-American communities specifically, has more severe symptoms exhibited when a person has PTSD. So why are we talking about this? Well, because the collateral consequences of having these symptoms are consequences in the school system. You've heard, about the school to prison pipeline, consequences in terms of behaviors, not completing school, more when you have interactions with the police, now they're more likely to get volatile. Again, the collateral consequences of trauma have long-term implications, feelings of anger and rage, riskier destructive behavior, suicidal thoughts, and it can affect education. So, of all the kids that get expelled from school with our zero tolerance policy, 95% of them are just for monkey business. I used to work in the school system. And back then, as my children would say, before the Earth's crust had cooled, when kids had behaviors, the teacher dealt with the behaviors. But with zero tolerance policies now, the school, the police officer in the school and behavior specialists deal with the behaviors. So 5% of those kids really had behaviors that were considered dangerous. And so the sad thing about this is that the best way to keep kids, once kids get into the criminal justice system, they stay in. Overwhelmingly, they stay in. And the key is to not get them there in the first place. And so 95% of the kids that end up with suspensions, it's for monkey business. It's for behaviors. It's for moving, too much. It's for some of that fight or flight kind of behavior. And this is part of that whole pipeline that leads to school failure and an introduction into the prison system. But the thing that I just want to point out is that youth with mental illnesses have the highest school dropout and failure rates of any disability group in the US. We can't afford this, especially when we know that children who have a mental health condition, that behavior is the language that they use to tell you something is wrong. They may not have the language, but their behavior is what's telling you something is wrong. So we cannot, our first line of defense cannot be punishment. We have to put something between behavior and punishment, and that needs to be a process that figures out what really is going on. All right, other collateral consequences, and so we all are on the same page. Collateral consequences are a list of punishments experienced by those who've been arrested, including those who weren't convicted of a felony or never served time. And so there are consequences for even low-level crimes that are considered misdemeanors, that a person with a misdemeanor, it can affect their ability to be first-time home buyers. And so when you think about a community that's over-policed, you're beginning to see a picture where, the walls are closing in. So, maybe you're stopped for loud noise, or maybe you're just stopped and questioned. All of those things have consequences. If you're a person who's been convicted of a felony, there are over 40,000 consequences for someone who's been convicted of a felony. 40,000 consequences. How on earth does someone reintegrate into society when there's an impact to housing, to being able to get a job, to being able to do banking, to be able to buy a car? I mean, it's stacked. And all of these things create stress on top of somebody who is already has layers of trauma. So all of this serves to culminate in a loss of access and opportunity, housing, jobs, education. And we know that people of color are more likely to be on the lower ladder of the economics. Social exclusion, prejudice, differential access to and treatment by the healthcare system, all can and do impact health. But the single strongest predictor of our health is our position on the class pyramid. So if you look at all of these things, the different levels of trauma and the impact of the trauma, the 40,000 consequences, low-level consequences, consequences in school, it is the perfect storm to ensure, number one, mental health challenges, and number two, loss of opportunity and access. So it's no surprise that the choices then that people make are only based on the small choices that they have left. And so that's why we see a good number of people who I call it failure to thrive for adults. So for people of color, the most prevalent way that people of color access mental health help is actually through the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is increasingly the method of treatment for people of color. The problem with this is that often once a person has become involved with the criminal justice system, it is after the trajectory of their life has been pretty significantly altered. Remember, even a misdemeanor has significant consequences. So recall that earlier we discussed how more types of trauma experiences increase the likelihood that trauma will affect mental health. This is where it all comes together. So you hear a lot that, well, you know, the people in the community are resilient. And, you know, a lot of people are resilient, but resilience should not be the method of coping with stress and adversity on a day-to-day basis. A person should not have to get up every day and be resilient, because what that means is they are in an environment of stress and adversity that further complicates their mental health situation. All right, so gone through a lot, but why is all of this important? And why are people reluctant, people of color especially, to reach out and ask for help or continue with help or even make that first call? Well, a lot of people of color and other people have had past experience with systems that were very negative. I did a research study about 3 years ago where I talked with African-American men across the state. Not like there's a lot all over the state, but, and one of the things that came out really clearly in that research was that the reason many African-American men don't reach out for doctor's appointments to, you know, get health insurance is because their experience with systems has been so degrading, humiliating, and results in a loss of face, you know, for them, that they, even when it's for their benefit, they choose not to run the risk of further being exposed to situations that make them, I call it losing face. People generally know what that means. So what the study also showed that they actually rely on women, sisters, daughters, ex-girlfriends, moms to reach out for their systems for them, because it's more acceptable for a woman to go into a situation where it may be humiliating or embarrassing than for them. And so they are often the bridges to mental health and medical health, all right? And so even ex-girlfriends, I was very surprised at their role in connecting to medical and mental health. A good number of people have low literacy, whether you were raised in this country or came from another country. And it's very shaming and humiliating for people to find out. Very often people who are illiterate or have low literacy go through extreme measures to hide it or to find others who can read and interpret things for them. So part of that is we have a system that really requires a certain level of literacy that everyone hasn't necessarily attained. you know, another 10-year research study that I did when I worked with homeless and highly mobile people here in Minnesota, centered around how we expect people to grow up and be first-class citizens when all their childhood and their life, they were second-class citizens. So they had no examples of first-class citizenship, had never been treated that way, and they were, through no fault of their own, exposed to systems that provided what they deserved, and I put that in quotation marks, rather than what they actually needed or desired. And so as adults, if you have not had the experience of identifying your needs and actually getting them met, soon you quit having needs, right? So when people grow up, we expect first-class citizenship out of people that have been firmly ensconced in second-class citizenship. And so all of these things together can be huge barriers to people of color reaching out and accessing not only mental health care, but physical health care. So it's a system that has a lot of language that most folks are not aware of. We use a lot of language, just assuming everyone is at the same point on the continuum, rather than starting at square one and bringing everybody forward. And that means not using jargony language and being sensitive to hearing the language that the individual uses to describe what they're feeling in themselves, rather than mental health language. So why is reaching out and helping bridge people's need for mental and medical health care so important? And why reaching out and helping people and tearing down systems that contribute to stress and trauma, why is it so important? Well, I'm going to skip to this one. Because they create trauma. They also trigger a trauma response in people who have already been traumatized. And we know that trauma is a risk factor in almost all behavioral health and substance use disorders. We cannot afford to have systems that are not trauma informed, and to not tear down systems that contribute to large swaths of the community being traumatized. So the things that it affords people, people, when they have a mental illness, it affects so many aspects of their life: decision-making, emotion regulation, all the things that can cause you to have interaction with the police, be kicked out of school. All sorts of negative interactions. It also, untreated, also can affect things such as sleep, appetite. These are all symptoms of mental illnesses that are really, really important to deal with, to ensure safety and to mitigate some of the trauma that these symptoms cause. All right, again, trauma is a risk factor in almost all behavioral health and substance use disorder. The last, we're down to our last couple of slides, is it's really important that as a community, for people, that we understand that we see acts of terrorism or racism, that it affects communities, not just individuals. We're all part of communities. When children were put in cages in the border, we know that affected Hispanic and the Latino people, but it also affected, African-American people and African people. And so what we need in terms of a trauma response is have a community response as well. And understand that when these things happen, there is fallout in the community. And with people who already have a level of trauma, we're talking about people now who may be triggered. So the last couple of things I want to do is just say, you have a really important role. I absolutely love the model that you have, that you carry the burden for someone who may not be able to carry the burden themselves, to help reach out to resources. Keep doing it, because that's exactly what, in all the studies we've done, people have identified that they've needed, that when they're in the heat of that situation, they may not be able to make that call. They may not be able to follow through. They may not be able to do anything more than call you and cry on the phone. And so I first want to commend you for it. And then I want to open it up for discussion or questions. Any discussion or questions? Oh, I see something in the chat. Let's see what that is. Oh, okay. That's about suicide prevention training.
I have a question. Having just gone through this DE&I training,
okay,
and we talked about it in our groups too, like there's a fear of even broaching the topic or asking the question will lead to the perception of a microaggression, or in your words, a macroaggression. So how do we avoid that without appearing condescending, or that whole savior complex, or, all those other things that kind of get lumped in with that? What is our best approach to reach out and be helpful, other than just, be that person in my white church in Chanhassen, which doesn't feel like it's really doing much?
Genuine, caring, and able to listen. Somebody who is in crisis, and that no matter who they are, that's what they need. And sometimes we make mistakes, and you know what? The earth will still continue on its axis to turn. And this is the whole process of learning. There's one part of learning your own approach that works for you. And then there's the process that you can make mistakes, and it's okay. And you can still go on and things and still have a good outcome and a good interaction. Most often saying the wrong thing with sincerity is much less damaging to a relationship than saying the right thing with insincerity. And so it's also being gutsy enough to be your genuine self, to be your genuine self. But thank you. That was a great question, because I know that there is fear to ask those questions. And I think about, we had someone come and talk about, from the LGBTQ community, come and talk about just the right language and what it means, gender versus sex. Just to lay it out. And almost everybody in this room, full of really highly trained people, admitted that they avoid talking about LGBTQ issues because they're afraid of insulting someone or saying the wrong thing. And sometimes silence is even more wrong than something you may inadvertently say.
Cynthia, this is Valerie Dean. I have a somewhat related question. So I'm wondering how we can best encourage someone who's already been traumatized by the system to leap into another system that may be beneficial, but again, might be one that they would be leery of entering into. So I'm wondering how best to, when you approach someone who you think could benefit from mental health resources, how do you present those ideas or those resources in a way that would engender trust?
Trust is the number one thing that helps people kind of overcome that challenge. But the first thing is to listen to what they need. In general, I find that people who are at that point want to be safe in an interaction, right? And so in those instances, I almost always only refer to people that I know to be safe with the kinds of issues that they need safety with, if you know what I mean. you know, if safety means that they're not judged, or that they're not judged because they're children or in child protection, you know, then I make sure that I do good referrals to people that I know will keep them safe. The other thing is that most people of color, and in fact, most people in general don't know what to expect when they're first introduced into the mental health system. So then you have that fear of the unknown, you know? And are they asking you questions because they're looking to judge you, or they're going to do something to your kids? So be more, explain what's going to happen and what to expect. That is so important. You know, when I go out in communities and talk about just basic mental health, one of the things I talk about is why it's important to tell providers the truth about what you're experiencing, because most people don't. You know, there are some people that will share a little bit and then see the reaction, and they'll gauge whether they're going to tell you anything more or not, or they just play with you till the end of the appointment and get out and never come back. And so, but also when they know that you'll be asked personal questions and why, you can then feel like you're not being a guinea pig. A lot of people of color feel like they're being a guinea pig. And so, so knowing what to expect, generally knowing the questions, but more importantly is knowing that you have a right. If this doesn't feel right to you, you know, that you know, here's some questions that you can ask so you can decide if this person is right for you. It's, you know, I'm amazed at how many people feel like they don't have any rights in the mental or medical health system. They just go there and they get whoever they get. And if it doesn't work out, you go away and you don't come back. But the other part is like, you know, what are some questions that would be important to help you feel safe or to help you feel like you can trust this person? And, you know, usually in the classes, we develop a list of questions. And I'm always amazed at how people are amazed that they have the right to ask those questions of the professional, you know? So that helps. So trust, and there's some things professionals can do too. This is what a statement that I heard over and over and over again for the men that felt like they had a trusted relationship in the mental health system is when the mental health provider or the person working with them said, you know what, this was me or my kid or my mom. This is what I would do. Not what you would do, but this is what I would do. And that's saying, if it's good enough for me, you know, that this might be a choice for you. So all of those things kind of contribute to it, but it's really important to really listen where people are coming from. Have they had a bad experience in the past? What can you know, what do they need that you can identify that would also help in the process of building trust and following through?
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Any other questions?
Cynthia,
Well, yes.
It's Heidi, and I was intrigued. You know, in my early years of nursing, I was a newborn intensive care nurse. And when you talked about how the stress hormones that bathe the fetus in a mother who is undergoing trauma and stress, what kind of long-term effects, what kind of effects do you, I mean, it's heartbreaking. What is exhibited in those babies? What is the long-term effect in their lives?
I think the general effects that you'll see in babies with trauma, you know, in general, you know, sometimes they're inconsolable. Sometimes you just can't figure out what on earth they need. You know, there've been a number of different studies, you know, maybe an exacerbated startle response, or maybe none at all. You know, long-term consistent stress and trauma, you know, can affect you one way or the other. And I think you may see the effects as they get older. They may have school failure. You know, we talked a little bit earlier about, you know, anger management issues. And I wonder if there isn't a connection to things, to behaviors where children just have such difficulty regulating themselves. You know, and I think it, you know, it depends on, I mean, there are a lot of factors, so we can't just say conclusively, this leads to this, or this leads to this, you know. Did the mom have decent nutrition? Did she have OB care? Does the baby get decent nutrition, or were they breastfed? Or not breastfed? I mean, I think there are a lot of other confounding factors. But I did a training yesterday for a group called the Chocolate Milk Club, and it's a group of African-American young breastfeeding moms. And it was just so interesting that the doctor, she's a lactation nurse, midwife, PhD, talked about the benefits of breastfeeding to dealing with some of those things that you might see associated with trauma. And I thought that was just fascinating. So I think there are a lot of factors, but generally you see low levels of things like breastfeeding, particularly, you know, when people have really high stress levels, maybe they're working 2 jobs and barely making ends meet, you know. So in general, I would say that you'll see academic outcomes. You'll see maybe self-regulation challenges. And I know that that's not the case for 100% of people, because we allow for individualism, but it does have an impact.
Thank you.
Gosh, Cynthia, the last hour and a half went like that. It felt like it was 15 minutes. It was so great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I hope everybody learned a lot. I hope you were taking notes. I know I was. So much great information. We have about 8 minutes left. Does anyone else have just a last question for Cynthia? Otherwise, I just have a few things. It's your last chance. Well, if you think of it, feel free to put it in the chat box or just interrupt me. But I have 3 things I want you to think about. We didn't get a chance tonight to break into small groups, and I knew that we weren't going to get that opportunity. So I encourage you to break into small groups within your community, with your mental health team or your group at your church, or as ambassadors together. And think about what you learned tonight. Discuss how this information can be implemented in your community. Did you think of someone when we were going through this tonight? Because I know I did. When Cynthia listed some of the things of trauma and some of the behaviors, and some people clicked in my mind, and I'm sure that happened for a lot of people tonight. How can you do some outreach? How does this affect how you run your ministry, how you reach out into the community, how you support people? So have some of those discussions in your groups. I also thought about, think about how other people may have experienced trauma as well. Or what Cynthia talked about tonight, the BIPOC community, people of color. Now, she talked about some trauma effects, but think about if you also came from an abusive home. Mm-hmm. What if you also had parents that didn't care for you or love you? What if you lived in a very dangerous neighborhood? So it's compounded on top of all of the other things. So think about people in your communities that may have experienced some of those things as well. And it just helps us to understand why people behave the way they do and why they respond the way that they do. So some things that we have coming up, we're going to be in October, we have 2 dates. It's on our website. We're going to be talking about trauma-informed communities and how your community can become a trauma-informed community. We have 3 trainers that are going to be doing that. Take a look at the website under events, and that's 2 dates in October. And then also, Cynthia just talked about becoming a genuine, caring person who's willing to listen. That's it. Just be open. And at our November ambassador meeting, that is exactly what that meeting is about. We're going to be welcoming Faith Partners, which is a national organization. And they're going to be talking to us about how to be active listeners, how to enter into a conversation with somebody that may have experienced trauma, that may have a mental health concern. How do we how do we enter into that conversation and listen and have the tools and the resources to support people? Because as you saw tonight, so many people have mental health concerns. So many of us have had or have mental health concerns and diagnoses. So it affects every single one of us. So this was great tonight. Thank you so much, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Any last question before we wrap up? Did you think of anything?
So Vicki, this is recorded, right?
It is recorded, yeah.
On our website, so anybody can go and listen to it, or just ambassadors?